Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. So the yellow version of the PowKiddy RGB30 just arrived in the mail yesterday, and so I wanted to do a quick video right here just kind of showing off the color, and then also checking to see whether or not there are any hardware revisions from the previous model that I reviewed a couple months back to this new one here. Now if you're not familiar with the RGB30, this is one of my favorite handhelds under $100 right now. And there's a few things that set it apart. Number one, it's quite comfortable to hold, but the most important part is the screen. This has a 1:1 aspect ratio and a 720p resolution, and it just so happens that this can scale perfectly for a bunch of my favorite retro games. And I've already made a couple videos about this device in general, number one just being a big review talking about all the reasons why I love it, and I also made an entire starter guide, so if you do pick one of these up, I will walk you through the entire setup process. So in this video we're really just going to be looking at the color and any hardware revisions in case you're interested. So without any further delay, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, as we get into the unboxing portion, it looks like there's no change here whatsoever. The only thing that was different was they put a little sticker on the side here to indicate that it's not one of the original colors. And it also looks like there's no changes within the box either. We've got a USB-C to USB-A charging cable, and then a quick set of instructions that'll walk you through hotkeys and what each button does. Now let's get to the star of the show and check out the RGB30 itself. And first impressions here, this is actually a lot more of an intense yellow color than I was expecting. I think the 3D renders that they had on their website made it look a little bit less yellow. Here I'm seeing that the yellow is actually quite intense, and then also the color balance is skewed more towards the red side than it is green. And for me, that's a good thing. I think that anytime you have a yellow that has a bit of a greenish tint to it, it looks a little sickly. Now, to be fair, because I am displaying this on a green background, looking back at the footage myself, it does look a little bit more green than it does in reality. So here's a little footage of it against a white background, and I hope you can see the reddish tint to it here. I guess the way that I would describe it is that it's definitely more towards the orange end of the yellow spectrum than not. Or to give it a completely non-technical description, I would say it's almost like a block of cheddar cheese. But to be honest, I really like the deep yellow color right here, and I wouldn't consider this to be something that's bright or loud either. And I think part of that has to do with the black components that offset that yellow color. It gives it a bit more of a subtle vibe overall. Now looking at the rest of the outer hardware, it doesn't look like anything else has changed. And I think that's a good thing. I didn't really have any complaints about the hardware other than the fact that it does feel a little bit cheap. But also bear in mind this device is $90 after shipping, so my expectations are not super high. And I think at this price point we got a ton of functionality. In addition to Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, this also has HDMI out. And that combination plus price point is not something that you see all the time. Now I bought this device directly from the PowKiddy website, and I opted for the cheapest version, which means it's not going to come with an additional games SD card. Instead, it'll just come with one single 16GB card, and this looks to be the same brand SD card that we've seen in previous RGB30s. Now turning this on, you can see it has the full official Jealous operating system within, and if we go into the system settings and information, you can see that the build date here is actually October 29th. And as of making this video, that build date is only 2 weeks ago, so it's pretty neat that we have something so up to date. And of course, you can update it via Wi-Fi to get the latest version as well. Next, let's take a quick comparison against other color models in case you're interested in something else. And here is my original white RGB30. And when you put them next to each other, you can see that color difference pretty starkly. And I have to be honest, between the two, I think I prefer the yellow version over the white one. Now don't get me wrong, I really like the black and white contrast of the original, but I don't know, there's something about that yellow and black. It's got a bit of a bumblebee look to it. And like I mentioned, the yellow is more subtle than I was expecting. I don't have a ton of yellow devices on me right now, but let's do a couple other comparisons. Here is the Nintendo Switch Lite, which I think is a bit more of a greenish tint altogether in comparison between the two. So I definitely like the yellow on the PowKiddy more than the Nintendo one. Next is the version 4 of the Miu Mini. And this one's interesting. The yellow is definitely less intense, but it still is more on that red or orange spectrum. And I like both of these a lot, and I would say maybe I prefer the less intense yellow on the Miu Mini over the RGB30. But when looking at the RGB30 on its own or in comparison to the white model, I still really like that yellow one. So I guess to summarize, I would say maybe it's not a perfect yellow, it could be a little bit less intense, but I think they nailed it when it comes to that yellow tone, and having the black components offset that color also is pretty complimentary. And another note here, I did take my other RGB30 SD cards and put them in the new one, and everything worked perfectly. I didn't really expect any sort of hardware revisions that would change the software components, but all the same, it is worth checking. Now, a couple weeks ago, I did an RGB30 starter guide, and that walked you through the entire setup process. And another thing I showed in that video was how to make some hardware modifications that will improve the overall controls. And so the white one we're seeing in this video here has been modified slightly. For example, I changed out the analog sticks. Instead of having these standard Nintendo Switch style Joy-Con sticks, it now has magnetic Hall sensor sticks taken from another Anbernic device. And this one's a pretty subtle change between the two, although it does feel like I have more finite controls when I swapped it over. Another modification I did for both the D-pad and the face buttons is I changed out the rubber membrane that is connecting them to the PCB. And again, for this one, I sacrificed an Anbernic device and I used those membranes instead. They're a little bit more stiff and responsive, and so when pressing down on either the D-pad or the face buttons, it just has a little bit more of a click to it. And to be honest, it is a very subtle difference. Someone like me who's tested, hundreds of these things, yeah, I can totally tell the difference. But if the D-pad and the face buttons are not bothering you, I don't think it's probably going to be worth the effort of getting it set up. Anyway, all of the instructions and also links to buy any of those components are going to be in my written guide, which I'll have linked down below. Okay, next let's take a look at the internals and see if there's any sort of change that happened between these two. And to open this up, it's pretty simple. It's just 4 screws and then use a guitar pick to kind of go around the sides and undo the clips. And then you'll have to detach the speakers, the battery, and then the Wi-Fi antenna. And then of course we're going to do the same with the older RGB30 because I want to compare the hardware components, but then also I'm going to steal all these rubber membranes and put them in the other one. Either way, first change that I noticed is that the labeling is a little bit different on the batteries. The old one says JX while the new one says GZG. And I'm pretty sure this is the name of like the battery supplier or manufacturer, so not a big deal here. All the other parameters like the milliamp hours and watt hours are exactly the same. Another thing I noticed is that the shoulder and trigger buttons now have a different pad that's going to mute the sound. Personally, I didn't feel or hear any difference between these two, so again, this might be a supply issue and they just got different pads to use. And finally, just to check, they have not changed the PCB at all either. It's still using the version 1.0 revision. Anyway, from here, I'm just going to go ahead and change out those other components to do those hardware mods all over again. So I'm going to remove the 8 screws holding the PCB in, and then also the old analog sticks, and then I'll undo the ribbon cable for the display and then pull it right out. And then finally, one other thing I've noticed, they've put a little bit of cloth tape over the LED that's front facing. So this is going to diffuse the light coming from that front LED when you turn it on and when you're charging. And you can see the LED right here just to the left of my right thumb. And yeah, it does look a little bit more diffused, but honestly, I didn't think it was super bright in the first place. So no complaints here, but I am glad that they've actually taken a look at that and then addressed it. Now, while we're in here, one other modification I recommend is putting a little bit of tape around the edges of the D-pad connectors. And for this, all you need is just a small square of electrical tape, and you want to cover some of the inner half of each of these 4 connectors. What this will do is it'll reduce accidental diagonals when playing a platforming game. Something like Contra and even the Mario games are susceptible to this. And I found that the ideal size for these electrical tape pieces are about 17 millimeters altogether. And just to give you an idea of the sizing there, that's going to be a little bit thinner than the actual width of a roll of electrical tape. So it might take you a couple attempts to cut it down to the correct size, but I would say just take your time and see if you can get it. Anyway, other than that, I'm just going to change out the rubber membranes and then put everything back together. And so we're just going to do the reverse of what we did when we did the teardown. So now I'm going to jump into Contra and do the Contra test. Here I'm going to press down on the D-pad and then rock it back and forth. And as you can see, my character doesn't really move at all. However, if I move my thumb up just a little bit higher on the D-pad and then try to rock it a little bit more deliberately, yes, I can move my character, but this to me is almost exactly where I want it to be, where if I'm pressing directly down, it's not going to give me an accidental diagonal. But at the same time, when I'm playing the game itself, when I want to do a diagonal, I can do that no problem. So I think the ideal setup is to change out that rubber membrane and then also add that little piece of electrical tape. Now the other side of the diagonal spectrum is testing to see whether or not you can hit them when you want. So for this I like to do a Street Fighter test. Usually I'll use Ken or Ryu, and then I'll try to do both Hadoukens and Shoryukens to see whether or not they're going to work. And to be honest, on the original RGB30, playing these games wasn't really a problem at all because it was very easy to hit diagonals. And so really what we're just doing here is just making sure that we can still do these moves even though we've added that electrical tape. And I think it's working well here. I'm not hitting every single move every time I want to. And as always, there's a lot of factors involved. So for example, just my own individual timing in pulling off these moves. But I would say even with 17 millimeters of electrical tape in the center, it's still definitely Hadoukenable and Shoryukenable. Okay, and as we start wrapping up here, I'm just going to show a bunch of footage and talk about why I like the RGB30 so much in case you haven't seen those other videos. And like I mentioned before, a lot of it comes down to the resolution and aspect ratio of this display. The fact that the resolution is 720 720p, but it's in a compact device like this is kind of unheard of within this space. And it puts this device in an ideal situation for a lot of different systems. For example, because we have a taller aspect ratio, that means we can play vertical games and they're going to look great, and that's because we don't have huge black bars on the sides. It's actually pretty minimal. In addition, there are quite a few systems that have a squarish aspect ratio that are really going to shine on this device. An easy example is going to be the Game Boy and Game Boy Color, but there's a couple more obscure examples as well. Some systems that are going to look really good include the Game Gear and the Neo Geo Pocket Color, because these are also relatively squarish. And then of course we have the Pico 8 Fantasy Console. Now this isn't really a retro system, but the nice thing about this one is that it has the full native or Explore menu available. This means that it'll connect to the internet and then you can download games directly onto the device. And I seem to talk about this every time I talk about the RGB30, and there's a few reasons why this device is so ideal for that system. In addition to the novelty of being able to browse and play your games, the aspect ratio of Pico 8 is also 1:1. And so as a result, these games look stunning. In fact, it's probably the best they've ever looked on a handheld device before now. And of course, I don't want to leave the other classic systems high and dry because these also work out great. 4:3 systems like the Sega Genesis will also look very good. And then other systems like the NES, you can actually do either 8:7 or 4:3 aspect ratio depending on your mood. And it's a very similar setup with Super Nintendo, although I do prefer 8:7 with this one. And as you can see, it fills up a lot of the screen, and this is with integer scaling as well. Anyway, if you're interested in setting any of this stuff up, I would check out that starter guide I mentioned before, and as always, I'll have it linked down below. So anyway, that's really about it for this video here. I wanted to just show off the new colorway that we have available for the RGB30, and then because I like this device so much, I just wanted to talk a little bit more about why it is so great, at least for me. It's definitely not a perfect handheld, but at this price point, I have no complaints whatsoever. And I also love the fact that the more you invest into it, like making those hardware mods, the better it'll be. Anyway, let me know what you think of the color down below. If you haven't picked one of these up, does the yellow color option make it a little bit more compelling? Or do you think one of the other original colors look better? And also bear in mind, they are planning on other different colors. I haven't seen them available just yet, but it'll be interesting to see those as well. As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming!